Roy is a doctor. Hi, Roy. Please join. Roy is a doctor, and he's currently the CEO of a company called SomaLogic, based in Boulder, which has been around for a long time, and he's going to tell us what they're doing. It's in the field of proteomics, which is a very important area that in health that most people don't really know that much about. Prior to that, he was the chief medical officer for Philips North America, which is how we first met. But Roy, just go right in and tell us, what is SomaLogic and what is proteomics?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me back, David. I've really enjoyed the meeting and the conversations. Proteomics is the measure of proteins in living organisms. In the case of SomaLogic, we measure proteins in the human body. And by virtue of the ability to measure several-fold more proteins in the human body than any other enterprise in a commercial context, we were able to tell you things about your current health and future health that previously wasn't possible.
That's pretty cool. And so, I mean, so is it a nascent field? Is it a field that is going to be affecting our health now? I mean, we're measuring, how many proteins do we have, by the way, roughly?
So we've got 20,000 basic protein structures. I think that the important thing to know is that, genes exist for one reason. They exist in the body to make proteins. And so proteins are the structural and functional molecules of life. My 9-year-old asked me, hey, Dad, when I took this job about a year ago, he goes, Dad, what are proteins? And I said, well, everything you're looking at when you're looking at Dad basically is proteins. And he's like, oh, okay. He had no idea what that meant. So 20,000 basic protein structures in the body. And the problem has been that all 20,000 have different shapes, they have different concentrations, they have different locations in the body, different half-lives. And so the ability to measure enough of them at any one time to tell you something, from a signaling standpoint has been an incredible challenge.
But we've really only recently learned to really measure proteins in the body, right? But the science there, which you're so deeply involved in, is advancing rapidly. The key, though, is that as our health changes, as our behavior changes, the protein makeup of our bodies change along with those things, right?
That's right.
So that if you take blood after you've run a marathon, or if you have a flu, or if you even probably just tripped and fell, something would be different in your blood that could be measured if we knew how to measure it. Is that a fair statement?
That's right. And that's a crucial difference between what proteomics is going to be able to tell you versus what genomics can tell you. So genomics, has sort of captured the imagination and the funding of the world in this context of clinical diagnostics. I've got a couple of slides. Should I show these just to sort of drive these points home?
But the point about genomics is your genome never changes.
Yeah,
it's basically, okay, we can figure out what your genes are. They were that way when you were conceived, more or less, shortly thereafter.
Exactly.
And they're that way until you die. And sometimes that'll help us diagnose things or help us predict things, but it doesn't change. That's the key thing.
That's exactly it. As we say, they're not contextual.
Right, okay. So what are you showing us here?
And so this, just to drive that point home, so genes, you have one structure, one location. I mean, obviously it's in every cell of your body that have DNA. Some cells don't, but it's always in the same place. It always has the same half-life or how long it lasts, and it changes 0 times in your life. So this is why when you do genotyping, you don't swab your cheek repeatedly because you're going to get the same result. Proteins, on the other hand, 20,000 different structures, millions of locations in your body, 20,000 half-lives, and this is the key. During the course of your life, your proteome turns over 40,000 times.
I mean, completely turns over?
Yes.
Wow.
And so
it means it's constantly evolving.
And it's contextual, so it can tell you things about your current health state and your future health states based on context and not on some mutated gene that may or may not play out over time depending on age and environmental exposures, what drugs you're taking, et cetera.
So do you want to show another slide now, or shall I ask you a question? So I wanted to ask you about SomaLogic.
Sure.
You came in as the CEO roughly a year ago, a little more than a year ago, right?
That's right.
And The company, however, has been around for, what, 20 years?
20 years.
Yeah, so talk about that. And why did it take 20 years? And what are you doing?
Well, I think we're a metaphor for the concept that there is no such thing as an overnight success. It's taken 20 years to be able to measure this many proteins in the body. To develop a technology, so we have a proprietary way of doing this, but to also develop an assay in which the proteins can be measured. And then actually the most important thing, which is sort of, I think, referable to this conference, is the computing power to take what we basically do, and we discern patterns of protein expression at any one moment in time. The computing power, the machine learning that's necessary to look at those protein expression patterns and then correlate them with some outcome has only been available now.
So in other words, you've been learning stuff for 20 years, but until we had enough computing power, given the complexity of what you were trying to measure, we really couldn't put it to use.
That's right. So it's been a combination of developing the technology, the platform to measure this many proteins at one time, which again, we're so far the only company that's been able to do that, and then having the computing capabilities catch up with the needs of discernment.
So we're now at a state where we can measure some proteins, right? I mean, how many do you typically find you're able to measure in one go, in one person?
So we measure 5,000 at a time. We'll move that up to 7,500 at a time. And to put that in context, our closest competitor can measure about 1,000.
And okay, you're using it sort of in two fundamental ways. So talk about those two ways. What is it allowing us to do right now?
So the two ways we use it, one is that pharma companies are using the platform, and we've been selling the platform to them for the last 2 or 3 years in clinical trials.
For drug development?
Yeah, so you can imagine if you're in the middle of a drug trial and 97% of drugs have proteins as their targets, we're giving the drug company 5,000 pieces of data every time they put a drug in a patient's body. So is the drug hitting my target of interest? Is it hitting other targets that could be, I could develop a drug from in the future? Is it hitting targets that I don't want it to hit? And then another interesting thing for pharma, and this is a little bit of a departure that I'll ask you to go on with me for a second here. I'll talk in a minute about the tests that we're developing from this platform, the second part of our business. But as we're developing diagnostic tests from this database of protein information from humans and clinical information, the models that predict outcomes in humans, there are groups of proteins from tens to hundreds of the 5,000 each time that predict outcomes. When you look at the protein, so for example, we have a test that predicts your risk of a heart attack or stroke in the next 4 years. It has about 26 proteins that reproducibly predict that. 75% of those proteins have no known relationship to the heart. And so, again, it's a pattern recognition.
And yet we know there's a correlation.
Well, we know there's a correlation because it's consistently there. And of course, pharma is keenly interested in understanding that network biology because embedded in that information in the future will be other important drug targets.
So it's a way of continuing to expand our knowledge, which is, even as we do this, proven to be shockingly small about how we actually work, right? But as we seek to develop new drugs, this should accelerate that process.
Yeah, and it even goes beyond that. So there's a reason why a lot of biologic drugs haven't panned out to be as effective as we had hoped. Some of the first generation biologic drugs were directed at mutated genes. So here's a gene that's mutated in an illness. This must be the gene of importance, and that gene creates a protein, and they designed a drug to inhibit that protein or target that protein. The problem is that there's something called a pleiotropic effect, where the protein that gene makes then affects maybe 100 other proteins, and it's one of those 100 other proteins that is the actual target. If you can only measure 1,000 of the 20,000 proteins in the body, the likelihood of finding that protein that it's affecting is incredibly low, but with our platform, pharma is actually being able to discern that.
And you just did a huge deal with Novartis, for example, and you have other such deals in the works.
That's right.
Where they basically will make using SomaLogic's testing a key part of their drug development process.
That's right.
So you go ahead, sorry.
Well, but you asked me about the two ways in which we're using our platform. So we think that's pretty exciting, and we think that'll be impactful, but we also think it sort of pales in comparison to the other thing that we're doing.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that is creating these diagnostic tests. I'll just show a couple of...
In clinical use.
So
basically,
for clinical use.
Using it on us, when we go to the doctor, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so again, the concept here is that at any one moment in your body, some of your cells are excreting proteins actively, and then other cells are dying and releasing proteins into your bloodstream. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of proteins in your blood at any one moment. We take blood samples. We've done this 300,000 times from human samples. And then we use bioinformatics to create models that predict, again, current health and future health based on that. And so here's the pipeline of tests we have in development. The ones on the left, several of these have already been released in sort of a limited release locally in Colorado, where we're looking at logistics, sample movement, reports and so forth. But I'll point a couple of things out. So I mentioned earlier that one of these primary cardiovascular risks, so half the tests are medical and half of them are health and wellness. And again, this is a departure from genomics. Genomics can't tell you anything about your current body's physiology, but we can, because that's what proteins signal. So on the medical side, one of the tests we just released is primary cardiovascular risk. So what is my risk of a heart attack or stroke in the next 4 years? That might be important to know. And on health and wellness, for example, we've got a test there for aerobic fitness. And so currently, if you want to know what your VO2 max is, you have to get on a treadmill with a mask on and exercise yourself to exhaustion. We can do that just from 60 microliters of blood. And you can see all the other things that are in the pipeline for the next few years to develop from this. And of course, each time we do this, we can do this, we can run all of these tests, depending on what's required or needed or desired, from one blood sample, because these are just algorithms that are run on the proteins, the protein patterns that are expressed each time we evaluate.
And of course, you mentioned you're only doing it in Colorado because the logistics are challenging. I mean, how quickly could this be expanded to be a national and then global opportunity for health improvement? And how expensive would it be? How much would it raise the cost of healthcare to be applying this?
Well, we're hoping that it can be done really quickly. But
and there's a possibility, at least, obviously.
Well, but there's some hurdles, right? So we've got some regulatory things to deal with. It's been an R&D. We've been an R&D company for 19 years, and so we have to build out a commercial infrastructure. And of course, there will be money involved to create, to do those things. As far as the impact on healthcare delivery, this could dramatically lower healthcare delivery costs. I mean,
how so?
Exponentially.
Really?
Absolutely. So one way to think about it would be, the way to think about these tests is they sort of fall into one of four categories: either more convenient, less invasive, less expensive, or in some cases they don't exist, they've never existed before. So for example, we have a test in development that will tell you if you have fatty liver without having to put a needle into your liver, which is currently the state of the art. And so we'll be able to supplant, in some cases, expensive diagnostic modalities simply from a blood test. And so that lowers the cost immediately. We'll be able to supplant the need for some physician visits. We'll be able to supplant, for example, in the third world, I've got this sort of vision in 7 years that a UN truck drives into a sub-Saharan African village where there's absolutely no healthcare delivery, lines up 200 people, draws a tube of blood, comes back to the central facility, runs 100 tests on the population, and comes back and delivers care. The other alternative would be to put a CT scanner, an ultrasound, and 15 specialists on that truck, which is not economically feasible. And then, of course, if you think about third-party payers and national health services, probably a better example, we have a test in development that will tell you in your population of type 2 diabetics who's at greatest risk for secondary complication over the next few years. And the ability to sort of bear down on that subpopulation, where all the costs are going to be rendered over the next several years, and to, rather than just saying, we'll wait and see who has a secondary complication and treat it, could have a tremendous impact on healthcare costs.
Well, one of the interesting things about this is it has tremendous echoes of what Theranos was trying to do, except that you've taken 20 years to get to a thing that's really expensive but might actually work. But the cool thing that he didn't say is that only in the last 2 months has this actually gone commercial.
That's right.
So, but it's still only being used in private medical practices that don't take insurance, because it is a little on the pricey side, but it is definitely a super, super promising advancement in healthcare, which is why we wanted to have you up here talking about it. And interestingly, we have somebody right after this talking about colon cancer, and I'm sure it could play a big role in reducing the cost of diagnosis there too. As we all know, that's an inconvenient diagnosis. So a tool to even ensure your health.